It's November 15th, 1268, and you are a peasant in medieval England. You have a simple life. You tend to your land, care for your animals, and love your children. You're going about your day as normal when suddenly you notice a small, light patch of skin on your arm that wasn't there before. You think nothing of it at the time, of course, life is busy, but your fate is already sealed. Before you know it, the splotches spread all over your body, and after some years, your face and hands begin to deform, with your attempts to hide your ailment being in vain. The local doctor comes to find you, and he tells you that it's leprosy. Within your lifetime, your fingers will fall off, you'll lose their hair on your face, and you'll be doomed to a life of horror, stranded on the periphery of society with others just like you, deemed unclean by those who used to be your contemporaries. The rest of your existence will be like becoming a ghost to the world, among the living, yet also envying the dead, begging for money on the street, totally unrecognizable from the person you used to be. Back then, there was almost nothing worse than being a leper. It was isolating, painful, and devastatingly lonely. It was considered by many a fate worse than death. Today, despite modern technologies and science, the historical attitudes towards this ancient, biblical disease still affect perceptions in the modern era. And that's not terribly surprising, since it is one of the oldest contagions known to mankind, affecting everyday people from the frigid wastes of Siberia to the tropical paradises of South America. This is the story of leprosy, and it was horrifying. But first, here's another horrific thing you might not have considered. If you're sitting in a coffee shop or an airport happily browsing away, you are actually putting yourself massively at risk. Connecting to a public Wi-Fi is like leaving your front door open. That is, unless you have the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark. Surfshark keeps your online activity private, encrypting your data so that naughty hackers and obsessive snoopers are left completely in the dark. And you have peace of mind knowing that Surfshark has your back. But as well as giving you protection, you also get freedom. Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in 100 plus countries, meaning that you can stream your favourite shows no matter where you are. A very handy feature indeed, since I live in Spain and cannot access a lot of British shows. You can even use it on unlimited devices. One account has you totally covered, totally safe, and totally free. Try it risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee and their 24/7 customer support to help you every step of the way. Level up your online experience. Head on over to surfshark.com/flashbackhistory or hit the link below and use the code flashbackhistory to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and thank you, the viewer, for not skipping the ad. The disease most people call leprosy, more formally called Hansen's disease, is caused by a bacteria known as Mycobacterium leprae. But in antiquity, nobody knew what caused it. Those who fell ill with the disease often seemed to do so almost randomly across communities, leading many to believe that it was a scourge cast down from the heavens as a form of divine punishment. Herodotus, the ancient Greek chiefly believed to be the world's first historian, wrote in 440 BC of Persian attitudes that were similarly based in faith. Quoting here, "The citizen who has leprosy, or the white sickness, may not come into a town or consort with other Persians. They say that he is so afflicted because he has sinned in some way against the sun." Of course, the story of leprosy is not a story of gods, but of men. It was first believed to have existed in Africa in early prehistoric periods, just as humanity was taking its first steps. And it's theorized that it migrated to Asia and Europe as early as around 40,000 years ago. Around half a millennium ago, it finally reached the Americas, just as man was arriving from Europe in greater numbers than before. Leprosy, it seems, has always been a part of us. And you can see that in texts and physical evidence we recovered from ancient times. Leprosy was described in Indian archaeological remains dated to 2000 BC, while it's believed to have been described in old Chinese manuscripts and in ancient Persia too. Even the Bible has the fable of how Jesus healed the leper. It has followed civilization, much like other diseases do, but on a much larger scale. If it wasn't so horrific, you could be almost tempted to call it an old friend. By the 4th century, leprosy reached as far as England, and by the 11th century, it would be a regular feature of life. It's through the medieval period, as well as older texts, such as those recorded in the Bible, which provided the bulk of humanity's knowledge about this everlasting disease. By the year 1400 in Europe, however, incidences of leprosy, which had been a mainstay for hundreds and thousands of years prior, began to mysteriously and suddenly decline. By 1600, the Renaissance was underway, and leprosy had almost died out in many European countries. Experts contend that this could have been owing to a multitude of factors. Herd immunity on the densely packed continent, alongside better sanitation and medical practices, contributed to this decline. A better quality of life, and a rise in tuberculosis, which has a similar historic makeup to leprosy, had strengthened people's immune systems in Europe, which at the time was the world's bastion for progress and scientific enlightenment. Today, leprosy has a smaller footprint than ever, but it's not completely eradicated. So, what was it like during the height of the disease to have leprosy? How were people treated differently? And what kind of nightmarish symptoms could people expect to undergo if they caught it? Well, let's start with the grisly stuff first. Leprosy affects the skin and the nervous system with extremely destructive effects if left untreated. And back then, of course, there were simply not many options if you were one of the unlucky few who contracted it. It often begins with light, discoloured patches on the skin, otherwise known as lesions, but over time it gets much worse. Skin eventually begins to break down, and ulcers will appear on the hands and feet. Small nodule growths will appear in some areas. People who contract the disease commonly find the hair on their eyelashes and eyebrows falls out. The nose usually starts to sink into the face as the disease eats away at its tissue. Eventually, it will collapse inwards completely, the appearance of which can leave sufferers looking like the undead, as their palate and upper lip are affected. That's not all though. As the disease ravages the nervous system, a person's nerves can be enlarged, leading to pain, numbness, muscle weakness, atrophy, and even blindness in its most severe form. As the years go on, and if the disease is left untreated, a person's limbs will begin to deform as the skeletal frame is weakened. Fingers and toes twist and contort into impossible shapes, eventually leading them to fall off completely. Sir Erasmus Wilson, an English surgeon and dermatologist who led a 19th century case study on several people suffering from the disease, commented of one man, quote, "He had lost a phalanx from the little finger of one of his hands. The rest of his fingers were bent in different directions and the hands distorted. He was unable to use his hands and was incapable of walking." A person can even suffer from face paralysis too, which in the most severe long-term cases can result in the death of the infected after their long and miserable episode with the disease. It leaves a person writhing in pain with their face and body changed beyond recognition to one of true horror. The famous writer Mark Twain took a voyage to the Sandwich Islands during his life, and he would later comment in a lecture about the first case he saw there, quote, "Unfortunately, the first object I ever saw in the Sandwich Islands was a repulsive one. It was a case of Oriental leprosy, of so dreadful a nature that I have never been able to get it out of my mind since." It is important to note that today, most people don't experience the most severe forms of leprosy like the case described by Mark Twain. But how do people even get the disease in the first place? The current scientific consensus is that it's spread by a mixture of droplets, such as in coughs and sneezes, as well as in prolonged contact through the skin. But generally speaking, it isn't considered to be all that contagious. Only a relatively small percentage of people in a given society ever had leprosy at one time, and diseases like the Black Death were much worse in terms of their spread, and tuberculosis, leprosy's a much deadlier cousin, continues to plague far more people and spread far easier even today. But owing to the relatively subpar hygiene status of medieval Europe, at least by today's standards, it's quite clear to see how leprosy did manage to spread amongst communities, just like the more deadly examples of TB and plague. Leprosy may have also been considered more widespread than it really was back then because of its similarity to other skin ailments like psoriasis or ringworm, which also showed a discoloration of the skin. Because of the physical injuries that a person with long-term leprosy suffered from, as well as the facial transfiguration and the severe disability it caused, societies like that of medieval Europe began to see those with the disease with actual repulsion and fear rather than just sympathy. Many were afraid that if they touched or even spoke to someone who was infected, then they themselves would suffer the same fate. And another part of this stigma came from its perceived randomness. People could fall ill with leprosy seemingly at any time. But the reality was that by the time major symptoms actually started to appear, the bacteria had already been inside their bodies for years. Leprosy has an extremely slow replication rate, taking weeks to double, where some bacteria only take mere minutes. What this meant was that it would take years before symptoms occurred, making things seem very random. The average was 5 years of incubation, but some people could go up to 2 decades never knowing they were sick and in the meantime passing it on to others. This is what gave leprosy its seemingly spontaneous targeting, and why people suddenly falling ill with the disease were often considered cursed by God. Being infected made life harder in every sense, of course, physically, emotionally, and societally. People who would illustrate the symptoms would be quickly isolated from common society alongside the others, where they would live in abject poverty, forced out by their families and communities. This is where the term leper colony comes from, and throughout history, the same phenomenon played out across the world. Just take the Bible, for instance, Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45, quote, "Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. Let their hair be unkempt. Cover the lower part of their face and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' They must live alone. They must live outside the camp." In fact, paradoxically, those with the disease actually once held something of a reverence in the Christian faith, at least in medieval Europe, where many believed that the infected were especially chosen to suffer on earth by God, and that it would lead to their salvation in the afterlife. As a result, they were often the recipients of Christian charity. Those who would care for the sick, just as Jesus had done, or who made charitable donations, thought that their good deeds toward those in need, especially for people of religious significance, i.e. lepers, would shorten their stint in purgatory whenever their time came. In fact, a whole quasi-religious cottage industry would form out of the sickness, as whilst isolated, sufferers of the affliction couldn't be held too far from society. Doctors were actually required to treat them as best they could, and in high demand areas, hospitals were built to help combat the disease. Churches would also need to be within walking distance so that religious figures could also do their part in charity. Meanwhile, the infected would need to be close by to population centres in order to beg for money, trade items, and offer services like praying for the souls of wealthy benefactors. Kept at arm's length, but not shunned completely. However, once the Black Death cascaded across Europe, leaving nothing but bodies in its wake, many of these softer attitudes towards sufferers subsided. Fear of contagion led to even greater restriction and isolation, whilst abusive and corrupt practices continued against lepers. After all, for the church, there were tithes to be made through people's charitable donations. The sick would be scarcely treated like human beings by most, with carriers forced to suffer inhumane practices like having to wear bells around their necks, announcing their condition to any close passerby, whilst covering their faces with dark veils. All the while, those with leprosy lived in squalor and pain. The Lancet and the Medical Times and Gazette would write in as late as 1868, after investigating the homes of those with the disease, that their houses were, quote, dreary, filthy, dilapidated hovels. Their lot was ultimately a harsh one. But would this pain and stigma ever truly end for those with the disease? The answer, as always, is complicated. Up until the 20th century, there was absolutely no cure for leprosy whatsoever. But it also, for the most part, wasn't fatal, except in extremely severe cases. That is to say, if you developed symptoms young, you would be doomed to much of your adult life being a living husk that people would sooner run from than offer charity. Since ancient times, various natural remedies had been used to try and combat the disease. Indian physicians used the oil from tuberca seeds and other plants to synthesize herbal tinctures to rub on the affected areas. It's still sold in some Indian bazaars today. The path to wrestling back control over this violent affliction started with Dr. Gerhard Amar Hansen in 1874. Hansen was a Norwegian practitioner who discovered and isolated the bacteria known for causing leprosy when assessing leprotic nodules that would appear on people's skin. His credit for doing so is why leprosy in the modern era is called Hansen's disease. Through his research, he was able to refute the various myths around how leprosy would be transmitted between people, proving it was mostly via droplets in coughs and sneezes, as well as close and frequent contact with the untreated. On this point, he would go on to say in 1895, quote, "There is hardly anything on earth or between it and heaven which has not been regarded as the cause of leprosy. And this is but natural, since the less one knows, the more actively does his imagination work." Breakthroughs in treatment, however, wouldn't come until 1940 with the development of the antibiotic known as dapsone. However, treatment with dapsone was pretty difficult and lasted for many years, resulting in bacterial-resistant strains by the 1960s. And that's when more modern treatments would also be discovered. Soon, a multi-drug therapy approach would be taken, lasting 6 to 12 months based on the disease's severity. It would eventually be adopted by the World Health Organization, and in the modern day, millions of people all over the world have been treated this way successfully. Great work is being done that may soon see mankind no longer burdened by our longest-serving illness. However, it has yet to be fully eradicated. There are roughly 200,000 cases of leprosy reported every year by the WHO across 159 countries. And people in rural communities where access to education and healthcare is rare still continue to suffer, as humankind has always done. Many more cases may yet still go unreported, and who knows how many people may still be carrying it with no symptoms at all, still firmly in the ignorant bliss of the incubation phase. And despite our modern technologies and science showing us that leprosy is not highly contagious and that there's no real reason to isolate a person with the disease, the stigma around it still exists, provoking fear and anxiety that's completely disproportionate to the threat that it actually poses. Leper colonies still exist, by the way, mostly in countries like India, where the disease is most prevalent today. The shame and ostracization of people from society is still ever present. After all, a leper is still a common shorthand for someone considered untouchable and to be avoided at all costs. If it were an accurate description, it would just mean a sick person. It shows, by the way, that when it comes to old diseases, old habits die hard. One day, hopefully, we will be able to eradicate this disease and also the stigma around it, which has caused so much pointless suffering for so many. Perhaps Mother Teresa put it best when she said, "The biggest disease today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted."